You see him standing there on top of a wooden crate, sweat staining the collar of his worn-out suit. He looks like a man who's been kicked by the world one too many times. And next to him is his family. A wife, her eyes fixed on the dusty ground, as if hoping it would swallow her whole. And 6 children, huddled around her like chicks around a hen, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. The man on the crate clears his throat, his voice cracking like dry earth. He's auctioning them off. Not cattle, not land. He's selling his own wife and children to the highest bidder. The crowd murmurs, a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. A man in a dusty bowler hat offers $8, but only for the 2 oldest boys. He needs help in his blacksmith shop. The father, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal, shakes his head. The whole family, he insists. They stay together or no deal. That's when a lone cowboy, a man nobody's ever seen before, pushes his way to the front. His face is weathered by the sun and wind, his clothes covered in the dust of a long trail. He's been watching this whole ugly scene unfold, and something inside him, something he thought had died long ago, just snapped. He hears a woman in a fancy dress bid $12. He sees the mother flinch, her shoulders shaking. He sees the oldest boy clench his fists, trying to be brave for the little ones. And then he hears his own voice, clear and steady, cut through the tense air. $15. Every head in the crowd turns to stare at him. The man on the crate, the desperate father, looks stunned. The woman on the platform, Catherine, slowly lifts her head. For the first time, her eyes meet the cowboy's. And in that one look, 1,000 questions are asked. Who was this stranger? A savior? Or just a different kind of monster? He had just spent nearly every cent he had in the world. But for what? He didn't just buy a family. He had just bought a whole world of trouble he couldn't possibly imagine. The auctioneer's voice boomed, "Sold to the gentleman in the brown coat." The crowd started to drift away, the sick spectacle over. They went back to their lives, leaving 8 souls standing in the middle of the street, their fate now tied to a complete stranger. The cowboy, Ezra Blackwood, walked forward. He felt like he was moving through deep water. What in God's name had he just done? He counted out 15 silver dollars into the auctioneer's sweaty palm. The man pocketed the money with a greasy smile. "They're all yours now," he said, before scurrying away like a rat. The father, Henry Henley, was already gone, having stumbled toward the saloon the moment the bidding started. He didn't even stay to watch his family get handed over. Catherine stepped down from the crate, her children clinging to her faded dress. She stood before Ezra, her chin held high, a spark of defiance in her exhausted eyes. "I am Catherine Henley," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "These are my children, James, Mary, Michael, Peter, Anne, and baby Ruth." Ezra nodded, his throat suddenly dry. He looked at each child. James, maybe 14, stared back with a look that was pure distrust. The twins, Mary and Michael, held hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Peter kept glancing toward the saloon, a heartbreaking flicker of hope still in his eyes. Little Anne sucked her thumb, her big eyes trying to make sense of the man who now owned them. And the baby Ruth slept in her mother's arms, oblivious. "I'm Ezra Blackwood," he managed to say, "and I reckon we need to figure out what's next." That's when the reality of his decision hit him like a physical blow. He didn't have a home, not a real one. He had a patch of dirt in a one-room shack 10 miles out of town that leaked when it rained and barely kept the wind out. It was no place for a family. "I don't have anywhere to take you," Catherine said, her voice dropping, the defiance replaced by fear. "Henry sold everything." Ezra looked at the 7 faces staring up at him, their entire world resting on his next words. He took a deep breath. "I've got a place," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "It ain't fancy, but it's got 4 walls." James, the oldest boy, stepped forward, his young face set like stone. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "Nobody just buys a family for $15. The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Every child was watching him, waiting for the answer that would define the rest of their lives. Ezra looked at the boy, and for the first time, he gave the only honest answer he had. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just knew I couldn't let you be split apart." His words were sincere, but they weren't enough. Not nearly enough. As he loaded them into his small wagon, he could feel the stares of the entire town burning into his back. He had saved them from the auction block, yes. But what had he really saved them for? The ride to Ezra's homestead was quiet and tense. The children were huddled together in the back of the wagon, their small bodies bouncing with every rut in the trail. Catherine sat beside Ezra on the driver's seat, holding the baby, her posture rigid, her face unreadable. The sky was turning a bruised purple on the horizon, and Ezra could smell a storm coming. He urged his horse, Dusty, to move faster. The last thing he needed was to get caught in a downpour with a wagon full of children and a cabin that was more hole than roof. "Tell me about your land," Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper above the creaking of the wagon wheels. She was trying to make conversation, trying to pretend this was normal. "It's not much," Ezra said honestly. 40 acres. Built the cabin myself a few years back. There's a creek." He found himself describing his simple, solitary life, and with every word he realized how completely inadequate it was for what he'd just taken on. What was a bachelor's shack for one would be a cramped, miserable cage for 8. He was starting to feel a cold knot of panic tightening in his gut. He hadn't thought this through. He hadn't thought past the gut-wrenching wrongness of that auction. As the first drops of rain began to fall, the cabin came into view. It sat in a small clearing, looking even smaller and more pathetic than he remembered. And then he saw it. Smoke was curling from the chimney. His fire had been out for 3 days, and there was a horse tied to the post out front. "Stay in the wagon," Ezra said, his voice low and urgent. His hand instinctively went to the Colt peacemaker at his hip. He was a drifter, a man with no enemies but also no friends. Who would be waiting for him inside his own home? A man stepped out onto the porch, and Ezra let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was Tom Peterson, his nearest neighbor from 2 miles down the creek. "Ezra, been wondering when you get back," Tom called out, a friendly smile on his face. "Saw your smoke was gone. Figured I'd keep the fire going for you." Then his eyes fell on the wagon, and his smile faltered. Didn't expect you to bring company." Ezra climbed down, his legs stiff. "Tom, this is Catherine Henley and her children. They'll be staying with me." Tom's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. But he was too good a man to ask the questions that were clearly burning in his mind. He just tipped his hat. "Welcome," he said. His kindness was a small comfort, but it couldn't change the reality of the situation. After Tom left, promising to have his wife send over some food, Ezra had to face the daunting task of showing his new family their new home. The inside was even worse than the outside. One small room, a rickety table with 2 chairs, a fireplace, and a tiny loft. James, ever the pragmatist, immediately climbed the ladder to the loft and came back down, his face grim. "It's leaking already," he announced, "and the barn's got holes in the roof. Big ones." Just as he spoke, the heavens opened up. The gentle rain turned into a furious, hammering downpour. Thunder cracked overhead, and water began to stream into the cabin from a dozen different places. "Grab that pot!" Ezra yelled over the roar of the storm. The next few hours were chaos. They used every pot, pan, and bucket they could find to catch the leaks, but it was a losing battle. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and a massive tree branch crashed against the side of the cabin with a sound like a cannon shot, making everyone jump. The younger children were crying, terrified by the violence of the storm. It felt like the world was ending, like the sky itself was trying to wash them away. But then, something strange started to happen. In the midst of the chaos, forced to work together against a common enemy, the fear began to fade. Mary found a mouse in the woodpile and gently set it free outside. Michael taught Anne how to count the seconds between the lightning and the thunder, turning her fear into a game. They were becoming a team. Later, as the storm began to subside, James cornered Ezra in a quiet corner of the cabin. The boy's eyes were blazing with an intensity that made him seem much older than 14. "I need to know what you're planning," James said, his voice low and fierce. Are you going to make us work your land like slaves? Are you going to hurt my mother? Because if you are, I'll fight you. I swear it. The boy's raw courage hit Ezra hard. He saw a reflection of himself in that fierce, protective glare. I'm not planning to hurt anyone, Ezra said quietly. Truth is, I don't have a plan. Everyone has a plan, James shot back. Nobody does anything for nothing. Ezra looked at the boy, then at Catherine mending a shirt by the firelight, at the sleeping children huddled together for warmth. What did he want? Maybe for the first time in his lonely life, he wanted to do something that mattered. Maybe, Ezra said, his voice rough with emotion, maybe I was just tired of being alone. The word hung in the air between them. James's tough exterior seemed to crack just a little. He looked at his family, then back at Ezra. We're not your real family, he said, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. Before Ezra could answer, he happened to glance out the rain-streaked window. The storm was passing, and the moon was breaking through the clouds. And in the soft, wet mud just beyond the clearing, he saw them. Fresh horse tracks. They weren't his. They weren't Tom Peterson's. Someone had been out there in the middle of the storm, watching the cabin, watching them, and a cold dread washed over him. The storm outside might be over, but the real storm was just beginning. The morning after the storm was deceptively calm. Sunlight streamed through the trees, making the wet world sparkle. But Ezra couldn't shake the image of those horse tracks from his mind. He and James were on the roof, hammering new shingles into place. But Ezra's eyes kept scanning the tree line. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He hadn't told Catherine or the children about the tracks. There was no sense in scaring them until he knew what he was dealing with. But the feeling of being watched was a constant, prickling presence at the back of his neck. You're jumpy, James observed, his voice sharp. The boy didn't miss much. Before Ezra could come up with a lie, he heard it. The sound of horses, not one, but several, coming up the trail fast. Get down, Ezra hissed, his hand already on his gun. Get inside and tell your mother to lock the door. James scrambled down the ladder without a word. Ezra followed, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. 3 riders burst into the clearing, and the man in the lead was Henry Henley, Catherine's husband, the man who had sold them. His face was blotchy and red, a mask of drunken fury. Behind him were 2 other men, hard-faced and armed, the kind of men who rented out their guns for a living. I've come for my family, Henley bellowed, swinging down from his horse. I changed my mind about the sale. Ezra stepped forward, placing himself between Henley and the cabin door. There's no sale to change your mind about, Ezra said, his voice dangerously calm. A deal's a deal. You took the money. A man can't sell his own kin, Henley spat. It ain't legal. The hypocrisy was so thick Ezra could have choked on it. Funny you didn't think of that when you were standing on that crate, he retorted. One of Henley's hired guns, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, shifted in his saddle. We don't want trouble, mister. Just give him back his wife and kids and we'll be on our way. And if I don't? Ezra asked, his fingers brushing the handle of his Colt. The scarred man's hand drifted towards his own gun. Then we'll take them. Just then, the cabin door creaked open, but it wasn't Catherine who stepped out. It was James. He was holding Ezra's spare rifle, and though his hands were trembling, his eyes were steady. He looked far older than 14. She's not your wife anymore, James said, his voice ringing with conviction. And we're not your children. You gave up that right. Henley's face contorted with rage. Boy, you put that gun down before you get hurt. Someone's going to get hurt if you don't leave, James shot back. The scarred man made his move, his hand flashing towards his holster. But he froze, because Catherine had appeared in the doorway behind her son, and she was holding a small gleaming pistol, aimed directly at Henry Henley's chest. The reveal was stunning. This wasn't the broken woman from the auction block. This was a lioness protecting her cubs. Hello, Henry, she said, her voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. Henley stared at the gun, his drunken bluster deflating like a pricked balloon. Catherine, put that down. You wouldn't shoot me. I once shot a rabid dog that was threatening my children, she replied, her voice unwavering. Right now, I don't see much of a difference. The air crackled with tension. It was a standoff. 3 armed men against a boy, a woman, and a cowboy who was hopelessly outnumbered. It seemed like it could only end one way, in a hail of gunfire and bloodshed. But then something completely unexpected happened. A flash of movement from the side of the cabin. It was 8-year-old Peter. He had slipped out the back and, with a loud whoop, spooked the intruders' horses. The animals reared and bolted, scattering in 3 different directions. The scarred man swore and took off running after his mount. The other hired gun looked around, suddenly realizing this wasn't the easy job he'd signed up for. Henley was left standing there, his backup gone, staring down the barrels of 2 guns and the unyielding faces of the family he had tried to discard. "This ain't over," he snarled, his face a mask of impotent fury. "I'll be back. I'll bring the sheriff. We'll see what the law says about this." He turned and stomped off into the woods after his horse, his threats echoing behind him. The immediate danger was gone, but his final words left a chilling promise in the air. Ezra looked at Catherine, at James still holding the rifle, at the other children peering out from the cabin. They had won the first battle, but Henry Henley had just threatened to bring a new kind of weapon into this fight, one they might not be able to stand against. He was going to bring the law, and Ezra had a sinking feeling that in a battle of a property owner versus a penniless drifter, the law wouldn't be on their side. 3 days later, a lone rider approached the cabin. A silver star glinted on his vest, catching the afternoon sun. It was the sheriff. Ezra's heart sank. He had hoped they'd have more time to prepare, to figure out a plan. Now the law was literally on his doorstep. "Everyone inside," he said to Catherine, his voice grim. He and James walked out to meet the lawman, their faces set, ready for a confrontation. Sheriff Tom Morrison was an imposing figure, a man whose weary eyes had seen the worst of human nature. He dismounted slowly, his gaze taking in everything: the patched roof, the determined look on Ezra's face, the flicker of movement from the children peeking through the window. "Afternoon," the sheriff said, his voice a low rumble. "I reckon you know why I'm here." "Henry Henley sent you," Ezra stated, not a question. "He did," Morrison confirmed. "Came into my office raising hell. Claimed you'd kidnapped his wife and stolen his property." The sheriff paused, letting the words hang in the air. This was it, the moment their fate would be decided. Ezra braced himself, but then the sheriff said something that changed everything. "Before you get your hackles up," he continued, "you should know I've been asking questions around town. A lot of questions." He walked closer, his hands deliberately held away from his gun. "Seems there were about 20 witnesses to what really happened at that depot." Ezra and James exchanged a look of disbelief. "And what did they tell you?" Ezra asked, his voice tight. "They told me about a man so deep in gambling debt he'd sell his own soul, let alone his family," Morrison said, his voice hardening. "They told me about a public auction, witnessed and legal, as shameful as it was. And they told me about a stranger who paid good money and treated that family with more decency than their own father had." A wave of relief so powerful it almost made Ezra's knees buckle washed over him. "So, we're in the clear? Legally?" "Legally, yes," the sheriff confirmed. "Henley has no claim. That sale was binding." He paused and his expression turned serious again. "But that doesn't mean your troubles are over." Catherine had come out onto the porch, drawn by the quiet nature of the conversation. "What do you mean, Sheriff?" Morrison looked from Ezra to Catherine, his gaze softening with something that looked like sympathy. "Henry lost that $15 you gave him, and a lot more, at the card table 2 nights ago. He owes money, Ezra. Not to locals, to some very unpleasant people from back east." The implication was terrifying. These weren't men who would listen to the local sheriff. They were predators who followed their own brutal set of rules. "They're the kind of people," Morrison said, his voice low, "who see a wife and 6 healthy children not as a family, but as an asset that can be collected and sold somewhere else, for a much higher price." The beautiful sunny day suddenly felt cold and menacing. They had escaped Henry, only to find themselves in the crosshairs of a much more dangerous enemy. An enemy that was faceless, ruthless, and coming for them. The family was silent, the weight of the new threat pressing down on them. What can we do? James asked, his voice barely a whisper. The sheriff looked around the small, vulnerable cabin, then at the determined faces of the family standing before him. He seemed to make a decision. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, silver star, a deputy's badge. He held it out to Ezra. I could use a deputy in this part of the county, he said. The job comes with a small salary. More importantly, it comes with legal authority. Ezra stared at the badge, stunned into silence. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a way to protect this family, Morrison corrected him. An attack on a civilian is one thing. An attack on a lawman's family, that's an attack on the law itself. It makes things official. He placed the badge on the porch railing. It's your choice. But if trouble is coming, I'd rather have it meet a deputy sheriff than a drifter. The choice was insane. A week ago, he was a nobody, riding the trails alone. Now he was being offered a chance to become the very thing he'd spent his life avoiding. A man with responsibilities. A man tied to a place. A man who represented the law. But he looked at Catherine. He looked at the children who were now looking to him for protection. He picked up the badge. It felt heavy in his hand, heavy with the weight of what it represented. He pinned it to his shirt. I accept, he said. The sheriff nodded, a flicker of a smile on his lips. Good. Your first assignment is to keep this family safe, by any means necessary. As Morrison rode away, the silver star on Ezra's chest felt like both a shield and a target. He was a lawman now. He had the authority to defend his home. But the sheriff's warning echoed in his mind. The real enemy wasn't a drunken gambler anymore. It was a shadowy organization of ruthless men who saw his family as nothing more than property to be seized. And they were coming. He had just painted a target on all their backs. The attack came without warning. One moment, the clearing was filled with the peaceful sounds of an autumn morning, the children laughing, the rhythmic chop of Ezra splitting wood. The next, the world exploded. A gunshot cracked through the air, sending a flock of birds screaming into the sky. Ezra spun around, his new deputy badge gleaming on his chest. Inside! Everyone, get inside now! He roared. But it was too late. 4 men on horseback had materialized from the trees surrounding the cabin. They weren't like Henley's clumsy hired guns. These men moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Their faces were hidden by bandanas, and their weapons were held with a familiarity that spoke of a violent profession. They were predators, and the Blackwood homestead was their hunting ground. Deputy Blackwood, the leader called out, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. He had cold gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. We're here on behalf of Henry Henley's business partners. We've come to collect his assets. Henry doesn't own anything here, Ezra shot back, his hand hovering over his gun. He was trying to buy time, to assess their positions. They were professionals. They had flanked the cabin, cutting off all escape routes. That's where you're wrong, the leader said with a chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. A man's family is always good for his debts. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. James was behind her, the rifle held low and out of sight. We don't belong to him, she said, her voice clear and strong. There are no assets here for you. The leader chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Ma'am, out here, the only law is what a man can enforce with his gun, and we have 4. You have 1. He dismounted, moving with a liquid grace. He was confident, arrogant. He thought this would be easy. That's when the plan fell apart. Little Peter, seeing an opening, made a desperate dash for the woods. One of the gunmen near the barn swiveled his rifle toward the fleeing boy. Little Ann screamed from the doorway. That scream, that tiny moment of distraction, was all Ezra needed. He drew his Colt and dove behind the woodpile as the clearing erupted in gunfire. Bullets tore through the air, splintering the cabin walls. The leader cursed and scrambled for cover behind his horse. James! Ezra yelled. The one by the barn. Can you see him? Got him! Came the reply from inside the cabin. A rifle shot cracked, and a chunk of wood exploded from the barn wall, inches from the gunman's head. The man yelped and dove into the hay, effectively neutralized for the moment, but they were still outgunned, 2-4. The fight was a blur of noise and chaos. Ezra exchanged shots with the leader, the bullets thudding into the logs of the woodpile. He could hear Catherine inside, directing the younger children to stay down, her voice a beacon of calm in the storm of violence. The standoff dragged on. Ezra knew they couldn't hold out forever. These men were patient. They would wait for him to make a mistake, for his ammunition to run out. It was a battle of attrition, and he was losing. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. He risked a glance toward the cabin. He could see Catherine's face in the window, her expression a mixture of terror and fierce determination. This was it. This was where it ended. He had tried to do the right thing, and it had led them all to this bloody end. But then he heard it, a sound that was more beautiful than any music, the thunder of approaching hooves. Lots of them, coming fast. Sheriff Morrison burst into the clearing at the head of a 6-man posse, their rifles raised. They had come from the direction of Tom Peterson's farm. The neighbor must have heard the shooting and ridden for help. The tables turned in an instant. The professional gunmen looked up, their confident expressions melting into panic. They were surrounded, outgunned, with nowhere to run. "Drop your weapons!" Morrison's voice boomed with authority. "You're under arrest!" One by one, the gunmen threw down their weapons, their hands raised in surrender. The leader, his bandana now slipped down around his neck, glared at Ezra with pure hatred. "This isn't over, deputy," he spat. "Our employer doesn't forget. He doesn't forgive." As the posse rounded up the prisoners, Ezra finally allowed himself to breathe. He gathered Catherine and the children, pulling them into a tight, desperate hug. They were all safe. They were alive. Peter emerged from the woods, his face tear-streaked but defiant. "I was going to get help," he said. "You did good, son," Ezra said, his voice thick with emotion. But the leader's final threat echoed in his ears. Sheriff Morrison walked over, his face grim. "These men are part of a big organization out of Chicago," he said quietly. "Arresting them is like cutting one head off a hydra. 2 more will grow in its place." Catherine overheard him. "So what does that mean? They'll just send more men?" "Yes, ma'am," the sheriff said, his face etched with worry. "I'm afraid they will." The victory suddenly felt hollow. They had survived the battle, but the war was far from over. They were now the declared enemies of a powerful and ruthless criminal organization. The small cabin, which had started to feel like a home, now felt like a trap. They were isolated, vulnerable, and their enemy was a faceless monster with an endless supply of men and guns. The next attack wouldn't be a surprise. It would be an execution, and they had no idea when it would come. The days that followed the gunfight were filled with a gnawing tension. Every snapped twig in the woods, every hawk's cry sent a jolt of fear through the family. They lived under a state of siege, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Ezra and James took turns standing, watch through the night. Catherine taught the older children how to load and clean the rifle. Their brief period of peace had been shattered, replaced by the constant grinding reality of their new life. They were being hunted. Then one afternoon, Tom Peterson rode up to the farm, his face pale and grim. He wasn't there for a friendly chat. He was bearing news. "It's Henry Henley," he said, dismounting before his horse had even come to a full stop. "They found him, in an alley behind the saloon in town." Ezra felt a cold chill despite the warm sun. "Is he—" Tom nodded slowly. "He's dead, Ezra. Someone beat him badly. The sheriff thinks it was the people he owed money to. Looks like they finally collected their debt." The news hit the small family like a shockwave. The man who had caused them so much pain, the source of all their fear, was gone. But his death wasn't a victory. It was brutal, ugly, and a stark reminder of the kind of men they were up against. A few days later, Sheriff Morrison confirmed it. Henry Henley had been killed by the same organization that had sent the gunmen. In their own twisted way, the debt was now settled. The men from Chicago had no more reason to come after Catherine and the children. They were free, truly, finally free. The cloud of fear that had been hanging over them for months finally began to lift. The nightly watches stopped. The sound of laughter returned to the cabin. Life began to feel normal again. They were no longer victims or assets or targets. They were just a family. And in that newfound peace, something else began to grow between Ezra and Catherine. a quiet affection that had been there all along, buried under the weight of constant crisis. They had been partners in survival, but now they could finally see each other as something more. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Ezra turned to her. He had been thinking about it for weeks. "Catherine," he began, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "we've been living as a family. We've fought like a family. We've survived like a family. But we've never made it official." He slid off the porch step and knelt in the dirt in front of her. He pulled a small, simple gold ring from his pocket. He had traded a month's worth of work at the blacksmith's for it. "I love you, Catherine Henley," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. "I love your children as if they were my own. Will you marry me? Will you make this real?" Tears streamed down Catherine's face as she stared at the man who had bought her for $15, defended her with his life, and was now offering her his heart. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ezra. 1,000 times, yes." Their wedding was a town affair. The whole of Millbrook Station turned out, packing the small church to the rafters. Sheriff Morrison stood as Ezra's best man. James, tall and proud in his first real suit, walked his mother down the aisle. As the preacher asked if anyone had any objections, James stood up. A hush fell over the church. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice clear and strong. He looked not at the preacher, but at Ezra. "I just want everyone here to know," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, "that Ezra Blackwood is the best man I have ever known, and we are the luckiest kids in the world to call him our pa." The church erupted in applause. At the back of the crowd, Ezra noticed two men in city suits. He recognized them as the lawyers from Chicago who had been sending threatening letters on behalf of Henry's creditors. One of them approached after the ceremony, holding out a legal document. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said formally, "this is a withdrawal of all legal claims. Our client's interests have been resolved." Ezra took the paper, looked the lawyer dead in the eye, and tore it in half without reading it. He dropped the pieces to the floor. "Something," he said, putting his arm around his new wife, "don't need lawyers." They walked out of the church into the bright Nebraska sunshine, not as a collection of broken pieces, but as a whole, complete family, forged in fire and bound by a love that was stronger than any law or any threat. It felt like a happy ending. It felt like the end of their troubles. But they had no idea. The greatest battle for their family's soul was yet to be fought. It wouldn't be a battle with guns and criminals, but a war of whispers and prejudice, and it was about to begin in the one place they thought would be safe, the local schoolhouse. Years passed. The small cabin grew, room by room, into a sprawling farmhouse. The Blackwood family became a cornerstone of the Millbrook Station community. Ezra's deputy badge was a symbol of respect, and Catherine's kindness was legendary. Their children grew, no longer the frightened, silent figures from the auction block, but confident, happy young people. But the past has a long shadow, and one day, that shadow fell across the schoolhouse. Mary, now 10, came home with a tear in her dress and a fire in her eyes. Her twin, Michael, was close behind, his fist clenched. Peter and Anne trailed after them, looking scared and confused. "What happened?" Catherine asked, her mother's intuition immediately sensing trouble. Mary's chin quivered, but she held her head high. "Tommy Morrison called us bought people," she said, her voice shaking with rage. Tommy was the sheriff's nephew, and he had been repeating the ugly whispers he'd heard from some of the town's less charitable adults. "He said you were sold like a cow, Mama. I hit him." The schoolyard fight was more than just a childhood squabble. It was the first time the children had been forced to confront the ugliness of their own history. The story of their beginning, which they saw as a tale of rescue and love, was being twisted by others into a mark of shame. Ezra was furious. He wanted to march into town and have a very serious talk with both Tommy and his father, but Catherine stopped him. "No, Ezra," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't your fight. It's theirs." The next day, Mary walked into school with her head held high. Tommy Morrison was waiting for her, flanked by a few of his friends, a smug look on his face. "Look, it's the $10 girl," he sneered. The other children laughed. The school teacher, a young woman new to the town, tried to intervene, but Mary held up a hand. "No, Miss Collins," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. It's all right. She turned to face Tommy, and the entire schoolyard went quiet. You're right, Tommy, she said, and a look of surprise flashed across his face. My mother was sold. My brothers and sisters and I stood on a platform while people bid on us like we were furniture. The children were silent now, listening with rapt attention. And you know what else is true? Mary continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. A man, a stranger, spent almost every penny he had to keep us from being torn apart. A man who gave us a home when we had nothing. A man who protected us with his own life when bad men came. That man is my father, Ezra Blackwood. She took a step closer to Tommy, her eyes blazing. You call us bought people. You're right. We were bought. We were bought with $15 and with courage and with love. I would rather be a bought Blackwood than a born Morrison if it means growing up to be as cruel and small-minded as you are. The silence in the schoolyard was absolute. Tommy Morrison's face had gone from smug to shocked to bright red. He had no answer. He had been defeated not by fists, but by the truth. From that day on, no one in Millbrook Station ever again dared to use the Blackwood family's past as a weapon against them. The children had fought their own battle and won, claiming their story not as a source of shame, but as a badge of honor. They had proven that the strength of their family wasn't defined by how it began, but by the love and courage that held it together. Years turned into decades. The children grew up and had children of their own. The farmhouse became a bustling hub of family life, filled with the laughter of a new generation. One crisp autumn evening, the entire Blackwood clan was gathered on the wide front porch. Ezra, now a gray-haired patriarch, sat in his rocking chair, a grandchild on his knee. Grandpa Ezra, the little girl said, tell us the story again. Which story is that? He asked, a twinkle in his eye. You know, she said, the one about how you bought Grandma for $15. Ezra looked across the porch at Catherine, who was smiling at him. He looked at his grown children, their spouses, their own kids. He saw James, the successful rancher, Mary, the doctor's wife, Michael, the respected school teacher, Peter, the deputy sheriff who had followed in his footsteps, Anne and Ruth, both mothers themselves, their lives full and happy. He saw a legacy, a forest grown from the single seed of a decision made a lifetime ago. Well, he began, his voice warm and familiar, it all started on a dusty afternoon at the train depot. He told the story, the one they all knew by heart, the story of a broken family sold on an auction block, the story of a stranger's impossible choice, the story of how love, against all odds, built a home and a future. It wasn't just a story about the past anymore. It was a promise that one act of courage, one moment of choosing kindness over indifference, can ripple through generations, changing the world for the better. And as he looked out at the faces of the family he had bought for $15, Ezra Blackwood knew, with a certainty that filled his soul, that he was the richest man in the entire state of Nebraska. If you believe that one person's courage can change the world for an entire family and that love is a choice we make every single day, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next story. And let me know in the comments below, what would you have done if you were in Ezra's boots that day? Thanks for watching.